Successor to the now legendary W123, the Mercedes W124 was objectively better in every single way, just slightly. And what's more, as a classic today, while 123 values are skyrocketing, the 124 remains relatively affordable. And no matter what you want to do with it, whether it's a polish on the weekend classic, drive it all year round no matter what the weather, like we've done with this one, drive it for 100 miles an hour for 24 hours through Europe, like we've done with this one, or just a cheap and easy to get into classic project car, the W124 is arguably the perfect choice for it. Fancy a bit of that action? Well, here's your buying guide to the Mercedes 124. Like most Mercedes of this era, the 124 is bomb-proof mechanically, but the bodywork around it tends to rot away, and indeed they are no exception, so you've got to pay attention. First of all, it's pretty much a guarantee that 90% of W124s have had new front wings. They will rot for fun, and most cars on the road now have had replacement ones, particularly the post-93 cars, because they had water-based paint on them, which makes the rust even worse, so do check a post-93 car particularly thoroughly. Have a look at the state of these front wings. They might be patent parts, that's no bad thing, they're only about 100 quid and tend to fit quite well, but look at the quality of the paint finish. Does it match between two panels? And yes, it might be the case that it's had replacement front wings because of rust and they've been painted, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't check for all the normal signs of crash damage, because it could well be because the car's had a front ender on it and then had new front wings on it, so still check that very thoroughly. When you've looked at the front wings, you want to look at the inner front wings as well, because these can rot. You want to look under the bonnet, and you want to look particularly under the screen wash bottle, which is massive and acts as a bit of a moisture and a rot trap in these cars. It's not an expensive bottle to replace, but of course you've got to take it out, weld it up. So get your finger up in here, check for any signs, there you go, there's some on this car, of mud and dirt just falling out of the arch. Make sure the actual inner arch itself is solid and check under the bonnet for it. Then you want to move further back. W124s suffer like 123s with rotten sills and jacking points, but on the 124 you've got these big plastic sill covers. Now obviously you can't very easily take those off when you go to view a car, so ideally you either want to be able to get under it, either on a jack or a ramp, or you want the seller to send you loads of photos to prove that these are solid. Again, you can buy new sills, but particularly on a lower end car for a couple of grand, it's probably not financially viable to get those done. Also, while you're under there, check the jacking points. Make sure these cars are jacked up in the right place, that it hasn't collapsed, it's been done properly, make sure it's in solid condition. So again, check very thoroughly. The doors, similar story. You've got plastic panels down the back here, and these can act as a moisture and a rot trap, so just look for any signs of bubbling, particularly here where the chrome trim actually meets the door itself. If that's starting to bubble away, you might take this off and find some horrors inside. Moving further back, you might notice the rear arches can rot as well. This car has actually already had repair done to it, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't look very carefully, because the repairs might be a few years old by now, but they might be starting to fade away. So do check those rear arches thoroughly, even on a car that might have been restored once already, because while it's not a guarantee that it will need doing or that it's going to be expensive, it could be the difference between a £2 car and a £4 one. Moving back up, you want to look at the rear window. It's not uncommon for the window on the saloons and the coupes to delaminate, to go all kind of milky around the edges, and it's not really an issue, but if you want a mint car, that's not going to be for you, of course, and the coupes in particular do suffer with rot round the rear window, and sadly if there's any signs of bubbling or moisture on the rear shelf there, that is going to need taking out and welding up, which again could be quite costly and complex. You want to also check on the convertibles the state of the roof itself. It's a power roof, so make sure it goes up and down smoothly, it's not seized, it hasn't got any holes in it, the rear window is in good nick. Make sure it seals properly and doesn't flap or let any wind or moisture in when you're driving along. And on the coupes and cabriolets, they've got pillarless doors, which, as cool as they look, are particularly hard to seal. So do just check on either of those cars that the door shuts, the window goes all the way up, and again, you're not getting irritating wind whistle by your ear while you're driving along. If it lets moisture in, that is not a good sign. Finally, not so much on this saloon, but if you're buying an estate 124, you want to pop open the boot lid and remove the plastic trims inside the boot to make sure the inner rear wings aren't rotting away. This affects 123 estates and 124 estates, and again, it's a lot of time, a lot of effort, and if you're farming it out, a lot of money to get that sorted properly. So these cars can rot in an awful lot of places, and again, if you're on the lower end, it pays to look carefully, because if you've got a lot of welding to do, it could get ruinously expensive. But buy right, and these cars really will last for the years. The 124 came with a wide variety of petrol and diesel engines. We'll start with the petrols, and specifically the 4-cylinders. On pre-1992 cars, they were 2 valves per cylinder, and generally they're pretty much bomb-proof. Just do regular coolant and oil changes, look after them, and they really will look after you. Timing change should be done every 70,000 miles or so, but they will get a little bit rattly towards the upper end of that. And it's also worth checking the particularly earlier 4-cylinder cars for head gasket failure. It's not uncommon on these cars, so just do the normal checks for the coolant cap and the oil cap. Look for any signs that the car might have been overheated and potentially bodged produced just to sell it. On post-92 cars, you got a 4-valve per cylinder, obviously 16 valves in a 4-cylinder case, and again, those engines are generally, objectively, a bit better. They're going to be smoother, a bit more powerful, and a bit more efficient than the 2-valve engines, but they do also suffer with a few problems in their own right. You can get stretched head bolts on higher mileage cars. It does cause a bit of shuffle on the head itself, and also you can get a cam cover oil leak, which leaks down the back of the engine onto the alternator, which will ultimately fry that. So you do want to check very carefully, make sure your cam cover gasket is in good nick. From 1992 onwards, Mercedes pioneered the dreadful biodegradable wiring looms, which cause all manner of issues for 124s of all vintages from then on, potentially to write the car off. You want to have a good look at the wiring on a post-92 car, look at it visually, is it splitting and crackling, and then just feel it. Does it feel like it's a box of Rice Krispies, or is it nice and flexible? A lot of these cars have had wiring looms done by now, and generally if a post-92 car has survived to this point, it's probably had it done, but particularly a cheaper car could be written off if it hasn't. So that's worth considering. If you get random electrical gremlins, warning lights coming on, the car not starting, just phantom electrical issues, run. You are never going to be able to financially sort that out in a viable fashion. With all engines, you want to be looking at the oil pressure as well. Start it up from cold and have a look at the oil pressure gauge on the dashboard. You're going to want at least 2 bar of pressure when it's cold and not running, ideally a little bit more than that. And when you're driving along, really you want to see 2.5 bar at an absolute minimum. If that's dropping below that, particularly when you're driving along with your foot on the throttle, that's a sign of an engine that's a bit tired and you need to watch out for that. Moving on to the 6-cylinder engines, which offer more power and of course a lovely soundtrack, they've got their issues of their own. Generally, if it's starting to stumble and misfire and be a bit down on power, it might not be your usual suspects of plugs and leads, because it's not uncommon for the distributor to get wet in these cars because of where it is in the engine bay and the water runs down when it's raining and it soaks the distributor and wrecks it. So you want to either be finding some sort of way to waterproof that long term, or just be mindful that every year or so you're going to probably want a new distributor cap. Next, inspect these cars for rough running and a rough idle. If they struggle to idle smoothly, they're revving up and down when they're hot and cold and they're just not smooth, there's a good chance it's either a split vacuum hose or a failed or stuck idle air control valve. Now, neither issue is particularly expensive or difficult to rectify, but it is worth bearing in mind if the car's not idling properly. However, it could be more serious. The petrol cars in particular use Bosch's Cagetronic fuel injection system, which is quite complex and very expensive and time-consuming to work on and repair. There's a lot of components to it, and if any one has failed, you could be into it for hundreds, if not thousands of pounds to get the car running right. So unless the car is criminally cheap, or you know for a fact it's ignition related, really you want to be seeing the car running absolutely smoothly with no doubts. Finally, on the petrol cars, they use twin fuel pumps. One just next to the pump on the driver's side of the car, which kind of sucks the fuel out of the tank, and the other one on the other side of the car that pushes it forwards down to where the engine is. If you can hear whining from the pump, it may not be the end of the world. People have been known to drive with whiny fuel pumps for tens of thousands of miles, but nor is it a difficult or expensive job to change it. In fact, it was whining on this car when we first got it, got a brand new replacement pump for 45 quid, and after a couple of hours underneath the car, albeit a lot of the time consuming was actually my ham-fistedness, you can have it sorted and the car running an awful lot better. Moving on to the diesel engines, Mercedes diesels of this era are bomb-proof. These cars get a good reputation for it, and it is well worth considering one. If it's not starting very well or it's not running quite right, the obvious symptom is glow plugs, but it's also worth checking the fuel filter because people tend to forget to do it, and if you've got a clogged up fuel filter, it's going to run like rubbish. Moving on to gearboxes, you can get 124s with a 5-speed manual and it's fine. It changes gears fine, they're perfectly tough. It's a bit of a notchy, unpleasant change to be honest. It doesn't really suit the car, but if you want a manual, they do exist. Just change the fluid in it regularly. And the automatics, again, are really nice. They're smooth, they change up easily, and they do kick down if you push your foot hard into the long travel throttle pedal. But don't be fooled if you don't think the car has changed up enough when you're driving along. Particularly in E mode, the gearbox will only start in second gear, and in fact, even in S, it will only start in first if you mash your foot to the floor when you take off. So don't be alarmed, they take off in second gear, there's nothing wrong with it. The 124 handled a lot smoother and was a lot more compliant and nimble than the 123 on account of borrowing a lot of suspension components from the 190E W201, and that means that most of the suspension components for a 124 are cheap, plentiful and fairly easy to change. Starting at the front end here, if you've got a clonk from the front, it's going to be a lower front ball joint. Now sadly, that isn't something that you can necessarily change easy on your driveway. You are going to need to get it up on a lift to do that, but they're not too expensive. If you've got a kind of stiff feeling steering, or like it's not really responding to the effort you're putting in, it is a steering box, but it's not necessarily a loose and wallowy setup, there's a good chance you've got play or slack in the steering box. And there's only so much you can adjust out of that. You're going to be into a refurb steering box potentially, and for that you're looking at between £600 and £800, not cheap. Also, if the steering feels a bit sort of vibratey at speed, and again, like it's almost trying to fight you in your hands, could be a failed steering damper. Not expensive, but again, another job that's worth doing. If you've got grumbly or wobbly wheel bearings, you'll be pleased to hear that the front ones on a 124 are adjustable, so you can get a bit more life out of those. But move your way to the back, the rear ones sadly are not adjustable, and that means when they start causing problems, generally you're going to be in the hole for brand new ones, and a specialist will charge a fair few quid to do that. If you've got leaky or groany rear shock absorbers on any model of 124, that means you're also going to need to buy brand new ones, but it's not the end of the world. They're not very expensive and it is a DIY proposition. The multi-link rear suspension on these cars is superb, and it does make them handle well, but there's a lot to go wrong. If you've got noisy, clunky rear ball joints, that means they're going to have to be replaced, and sadly it requires a specialist tool that means you are probably not going to be able to do it cost effectively at home. You're going to have to farm that one out. Likewise, there's a lot of bushes and arms going on back here in this multi-link rear suspension, and that means while it can be easy to sort out wandering handling or funny noises, if you've got to replace a lot of stuff back here, the costs can very quickly mount up. So really and truthfully, you want the car to be driving properly when you buy it. The rear subframe bushes in these cars can perish, and not only is that an MOT fail, but it is also a bit of a pain in the bum to change, because you've got to drop the whole rear axle, the diff and so on to get it sorted. So if you've got any noise from the back or the rear end feels like it's wandering, that could be bad news. Sticking at the rear end of the car, the Estate TE has got self-leveling rear suspension, actually derived from Citroen. It's got fluid-filled spheres. The parts are quite expensive, quite rare, and very specialist to change. So if the car isn't sitting level, particularly if it's got some weight in the boot, that could be a worry. Frankly, we'd recommend probably walking away from an Estate that's got a sagging back end. As for the brakes, pretty conventional. Four-wheel disc brakes, and they're generally up to the job, except on the smaller cars where you've got smaller brakes. But the handbrake, it's not in the centre console, it's not even the one up on the dashboard like a 123, instead it's a foot-operated pedal within a hand release. And it's worth bearing in mind, particularly on automatic cars, people might not have used it for a while, it could be seized up, so it's worth making sure the handbrake does go on and then release, and it does hold the car, because if not, that can be an MOT failure. Finally, one minor detail, these wheel trims look really nice and suit the 124. You can get the 8-hole bottle top wheels like the R129 SL, and you can even get them polished, which really suit these cars and look lovely, but they can corrode. And if you want to have them refurbished, it's not just a simple strip back and respray job. If you're paying someone else to do it, you could be in the hole for up to 500 quid. So bear in mind that. The 124's interior is arguably peak Mercedes interior. It's really solidly made, well laid out, and it's a lovely place to be even 40 years on. You want to just check that everything works though, particularly on a higher spec car. If you're buying a post 93 with that biodegradable loom, make sure thoroughly that every single electrical item works, make sure all the warning lights come on and go off as they should, look at the gauges, because any electrical issues on these cars can be a nightmare to sort out. Also, you want to consider the central locking. It's vacuum operated on these cars and it should work fine. Put the key in the door, turn it on all the doors, and the petrol cap on the boot should unlock and lock as you want them to. If they're not, then it's either going to be a failed vacuum check valve in the engine bay, they're only about 10 or 15 quid, and if you can just blow into the line and suck and air doesn't come through both ways, there's your solution. Or it might be a split vacuum hose, and the common accepted method for checking that is to get a smoke machine and put smoke into the car and see where it's leaking out, because that should give you a source of a failed line. The same is the case for the seat and the seat belt concierge arm, they call it, on the 124 coupes. Both of those are done with vacuum as well, so again, check those systems thoroughly. Finally, the interior trim itself, there are a lot of different options, from cloth to velour to leather and even MB Tex, which is kind of artificial leather vinyl stuff, and a lot of colours as well. Your typical greys and blues and blacks are easy to come by replacement parts, but the rarer trims and the rarer colours could take a bit more searching and a little bit more of that to find it. So that's what you need to know, but which one should you buy and what should you pay for it? Well, that very much depends on what you're after. 124 projects, saloons and coupes start from around £1,000, but do be warned, they're not always financially viable to get into. It's going to be a 4-cylinder, probably high mileage, and with a fair amount of tin one that is going to want sorting out. And given that you only have to spend a little bit more for a better condition example, a Project 124 doesn't always make the numbers add up. Budget around £2,000 meanwhile, and you can get a saloon or a coupe, like this 200 for example, that is ready to go and nicely drivable, if not absolutely perfect. We paid under £2 for this one, with slightly crusty rear arches, but sweet mechanicals and structurally sound. Up the budget to around £3,500 to £4,000, and you can buy a really quite nice example of a saloon or a coupe with a slightly bigger, potentially 6-cylinder engine in it. You're also into estate territory at that point, which gets you a bigger boot, 7 seats, and that little bit more practicality. Up the budget to around £7,000 to £8,000, and you can get some of the nicest 124s on the market in saloon, coupe, or estate guys. You can get a later facelift car if you want, you can get a 4MATIC, you can get the big 6-cylinder engines. The choice is yours. But if you do want a convertible, that is pretty much your starting point. In fact, you're going to push up to kind of 12, maybe even £13,000 for a really nice A124, as they're technically called, to buy a nice facelift 124 cabriolet. But it is a lovely thing, and values are only going one way. But whichever one you choose, from the £2,200 saloon to the 12 grand cabriolet, the Mercedes 124 is a great choice as a classic to use, restore and drive every single day if you want. The 123 might have been the best, but the 124 was arguably that little bit better. Don't forget to let us know down below if you've owned a 124, how you found it, and check out other videos on the channel to see us buying, road testing and comparing other Mercedes-Benz models with some of their rivals. But for now, don't forget to give this video a big old thumbs up, subscribe to Classics World for future videos, and we'll see you again soon.